Right, so things obviously aren't going too good right now. And yes, the pandemic obviously is going to be a factor in that. And yes, the war in Ukraine, and yes, there are world issues right now. But in the UK, there's another additional factor, which is the elephant in the room that no one wants to mention, which is Brexit. Now, back in the day when we were still discussing Brexit, one of the phrases that Brexiteers often used was, quote, tariff-free access to the single market. And I hate that phrase, hate it, because it's basically meaningless. It's not technically a lie, but tariff-free access does not mean you don't have customs paperwork. And access to the single market is not the same as being in the single market. So the suggestion that we could do a full hard Brexit, we could leave the customs union, we could leave the single market, and yet we can negotiate a trade deal that gave us the same benefits as we'd had being in, the tariff-free access to the single market, was a massively disingenuous statement. Technically true, but massively misleading. So let's look at why. Okay, so let's imagine it's 2017 and we're talking about trade deals we want to do. Remember, this is all pre-Brexit. What sort of things might we want? Well, first of all, top demand, the UK should have the right to make and enforce its own laws and not be subject to laws passed in Brussels, or not also subject to the European Court of Justice. But of course, the EU should have the right to make and enforce their own laws. And frictionless trade between the UK and the EU27 should continue. Or as you might put it, we don't want them telling us what to do, but we're not going to try and tell them what to do, but we still want to trade. And on the face of it, that all seems quite reasonable, except it's not. It's actually impossible. It's a classic Brexit triumvirate where it's pick 2 out of 3. Now, if you don't believe me, let's flesh it out a bit. So let's give an example. The UK should have the right, if it wishes, to change its laws to allow for hormone-injected beef, chlorinated chicken, genetically modified foods. So the hormone-injected beef is where you inject cows with steroids, so they end up like Ben Johnson or a 1980s East German shot putter. Basically, there's a lot more meat on them, and that's illegal right now in the EU27 and the UK still. It's legal in America, which means that most American beef can't be sold to the UK because it's illegal over here. So that's the thing. The Americans will want to change us laws to make their beef legal if we did a trade deal with them. And the point is, it's not about whether we want to do that. The whole point was a deal where if we want to, we can do it. The whole point was a deal where it's our decision as to whether we want to do it. So any deal had to accommodate our desire to be able to do that if we wanted to. And obviously though, the EU27 should have the right to continue to ban the production and import of all that stuff, hormone-injected beef, chlorinated chicken, genetically modified foods. And they should have the right to only allow foods in that have legal certification proving that they are none of the above. And then finally, let's imagine a couple of brothers in Essex. They make beef jerky. They buy beef, cheapest beef they can get. They're selling some biker bars and stuff. It's not hippie stuff. They buy beef, turn it into jerky, dry it, whatever it is. I don't know how you make jerky. And then they sell it. And they sell it in London, but also Rotterdam. They went over there for a stag weekend or something. It turns out that the Dutch go mad for this stuff. So their business model is they buy beef from local wholesaler, cheapest beef they can get. They make the jerky. They've got bilingual English-Dutch packaging, and then they said one of them drives a van to London and one drives a van to Rotterdam via the ferry from Harwich. Same products both, and there's no special paperwork or procedures. That's frictionless trade. It's no harder for them to sell it to Rotterdam than it is to London. Now, that's impossible. Why is it impossible? Because the question is, when their van rolls off the ferry at the Hook of Holland, is a Dutch border person allowed to hold up their hands and say, "Oi, we're not letting you in unless whatever is in that van has to be legal according to our laws, and you have to be able to prove that it's legal according to our laws. And if it's not legal according to our laws, or you can't prove it's legal according to our laws, we're not letting you and it in." Now here you're saying, of course the Dutch have an absolute right to say they're not going to allow it, because the point is this jerky is now illegal. They are making jerky that is illegal in the Netherlands because it's been made with steroids injected beef. There, you're saying the Dutch have a perfect right to say they won't let that jerky in. And here, you're saying, no, the Dutch have no right to say, to stop that jerky coming in. They must let that van roll off the ferry, no questions asked, no problem. And that's sort of a question where the answer can only be yes or no. It cannot be yes and no. If you have a problem at this point, your argument is not with Remainers, it's not with the European Union, it's with basic observable reality. It's with the way the universe works. You know, if you're an atheist, blame fate. If you're a religious, blame God. This is just how the universe works. So that is not possible. One of those three has to give way. Now we could say, well, why should they should just accept this? The Europeans should have to compromise. We've had a vote, so the Europeans should compromise. We can just say that we should be allowed to inject our cows with steroids. We should be allowed to make jerky with that steroids-injected beef, and then we should just drive that jerky into the Netherlands, no questions asked, and start selling it to Dutch citizens, despite the fact that it's illegal, according to Dutch law, which is EU law. Now, I've called that cakeist Brexit because that's what, when Boris Johnson said that he wanted that we could have our cake and eat it, this is the sort of thing he was referring to. And when the Europeans, as a result, start saying no to cakeism, again, this is what they're referring to, basically. And I could have called it insult Brexit. I don't think I need to explain why that's completely unacceptable. So let's get rid of that one. That is not going to happen. It was never going to happen. Only a lunatic would have thought that might happen. Okay, so we could then get rid of this one. So this is the soft Brexit, Norway plus Jersey option, whatever. This is where we remain a member of the single market, as Norway is, although we've left the EU. So we are still subject to all the rules set by the EU on products. So this means that these guys now don't have a problem. If the rules for beef are the same in the UK as they are in the EU, which means that their product is legal in the EU, which means they can just ship it straight to the Netherlands, no questions asked, and the Netherlands can let it in, no questions asked. The obvious drawback is that, well, we're now subject to all the rules and regulations that everyone supposedly hated, except now we have no say on them. We don't get to vote on them. It's now the European Commission and the European Parliament will set the rules, and then they'll just tell us what they are, as they do to Norway. This is sort of what Theresa May was going with her Chequers deal. Her Chequers deal was sort of ish that. She was trying to sort of square the circle, and it wasn't quite that. She was trying to fudge it, but basically ish she was going for that. At least she was trying, at least. But the point is, that begs the question, why bother? What's the point? What's the point in leaving if we're still subject to all the rules, regulations, all we've done is give away our vote? So that wasn't ever really a non-starter. It was ruled out as soon as Theresa May sort of ruled it out anyway when she said that we'll decide what the labelling is on a jar of jam in her conference speech, I think, 2016. We then end up with the final option. We end up with this, the hard Brexit, Canada free trade type agreement. This is not to be confused with a no-deal Brexit. This is a deal. It's just a basic free trade agreement where we're outside the single market and outside the customs union. So in this case, we still have the right, if we want to start injecting our cows with steroids to please the Americans. And the EU can then ban. They can say, well, that's fine, but those beef products are not coming in here. So we lose the frictionless trade. These guys can no longer just buy meat, make jerky, drive to the Netherlands, ship it, sell it. Now, if they want to keep selling jerky to Rotterdam, what they've got to do is they've got to source some meat that is legal according to the EU stroke Dutch laws. So they might end up having to get organic meat, but basically they need meat that's certified as non-steroid injected. Now the problem with that is it means that you've got to have paperwork all the way down the line. The farmer's got to have paperwork. The slaughterhouse got to have paperwork. The distributor's got to have paperwork. It's a whole paper trail has to be done all the way down the line, which is a massive amount of extra costs and hassle. And then it all needs to be checked. I mean, the customs people need to check all that paperwork and stuff to make it legal. There's some other stuff as well. I won't go into that. I think there's other stuff. But this is the basic point. it is no longer frictionless trade. Now they have to make special Dutch versions of their jerky with the non-injected meats. And so says they have to do that even if we haven't yet changed the rules to allow injected beef, because we're still outside the legal framework. And if we're outside the legal framework, the interpretation of the laws could be different. So because we're not in the same regulatory framework, even if we haven't yet, that's the worst thing, even if we haven't yet done that, the mere possibility that we could do that means we still end up with all of this. So that's what we end up with. Now, it might be that it's just no longer feasible for them. They're just two guys. It might be that they'd have to hire an import-export sort of agent to do all this stuff. There's all the extra paperwork. It might be it's just too much for those guys, and they have to downsize their business. Maybe one of them has to go off and get another job because the business is now only big enough to support one of them with the van to London. You might say, well, fair enough. Well, this whole other stuff. But there's an interesting point with Ireland, because I said that's what we ended up with. That's not. That's what Great Britain ended up with. Northern Ireland, well, let's imagine if we'd done that for the whole of the UK. And imagine it's not two guys in Essex, it's two guys in Crossmaglen, in South Armagh, from the nationalist community. It's a heavily nationalist area. And let's imagine their dad and their uncles were all members of the Provisional IRA back in the day. And let's imagine that maybe not all weapons were decommissioned. And let's imagine they still know how to use them. And you're basically saying to these two guys, well, you're just going to have one of you's going to have to go off and get another job. Imagine these two guys, their business model used to be one van to Dublin and one van to Belfast. And now the van to Dublin just isn't on because of this, because of the border that's been created. Suddenly it's not so fun anymore, is it? Now, people at this point, the Brexiters said, technology can solve the problem. And this is because the Brexiteers were obsessed with the physical border. They thought the problem was purely, what if the van going to Dublin has to wait for between 20 minutes and an hour? And that's not the problem. The problem is the massive increase in costs and complexity of their business model thanks to all of this, thanks to the difference between these rules and these rules. The problem was never actually the physical border. Well, I'm not saying that's not a problem, but it was much bigger than that. And now the Brexiteers will say, technology, magic technology can solve it. What they're saying is that the British and Irish governments could have spent tens of billions of euros/pounds developing some kind of advanced computer system where all this paperwork has to be kept by the farmers, the slaughterhouses, the distributors, whatever, these guys themselves. This all could be done electronically on some incredibly complicated computer system. And then these guys could still send a van to south to Dublin, but the night before they could upload all the electronic paperwork onto some sort of system, and there could be a chip on their van so that when they drive across the border, it all gets checked out automatically and that they don't have to stop. The two problems there is first of all, smugglers, bad people who cheat, people who buy a load of steroid-injected beef in Belfast, drive it to the border, relabel it as Republic of Ireland, non-steroid-injected beef, drive it across the border, and they've now just made a fortune. And if you're wondering, how would this new IRA, if they were that upset about the hard border, how would the new IRA fund all their operations? Well, I don't know, that's a hard one. Maybe by shipping beef across the border, who knows? The point is, the technology still, even if it's feasible, how long would it take and how much would it cost? It still wouldn't remove the massive increase in cost and complexity to their business model. It would just make it electronic paperwork rather than paperwork. And it's the paperwork itself that's the problem. So for Northern Ireland, we ended up with this. That's essentially the Irish Protocol. So this is what Northern Ireland got. And that's why there's a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And again, it's impossible because both Great Britain and Northern Ireland had the same choice. Pick 2 out of 3. And if they picked the same 2 that we picked, they'd have had a border with the Republic of Ireland. And for hugely obvious reasons, that wasn't wanted. So that's basically the issue with leaving the single market. I said there's a whole load more stuff on top of that, but that's the core issue. Okay, so let's look now at the effects of leaving the customs union. So before Brexit, it's what we'd have, say, for cars being imported into the EU from China. So if a Chinese car was imported into the EU, there would be a tariff, which is basically an import tax of 10% paid on the value of the car. So whatever the value of the car is, whoever's importing it would have to pay 10%. That has the effect of making Chinese cars more expensive and protecting car manufacturing in the EU, which pre-Brexit would have included us. And it's quite reasonable, I think, to want to preserve your car industry for there's a whole load of strategic and economic and political reasons why you'd want to. Okay, so then we leave. Now, we didn't stay in the customs union because we had a hard Brexit. So we are now our own customs territory, which means we get to set our own external tariffs. So initially, let's say we'd have the same 10% tariff. Now, let's say, which we did, we've negotiated a free trade deal, which means we have 0%, a 0% tariff. This was the fabled tariff-free access that the Brexiters always went on about. So now, previously, if you were a British car manufacturer and you sold a car to a dealer in Germany, well, it's from there to there are no tariffs because you haven't crossed a customs border. Yeah, tariffs are paid when you go from one customs territory into another. Now you might say, well, it's the same now, right? If a German company sells a car to a German dealer, it's 0% tariff. No change, yeah? Well, yes and no. I mean, there is no tariff. But let's consider what happens with China. And let's imagine that we negotiate a free trade deal with China and we give them tariff-free access to our market. So, if a UK company sells a British car to someone in the EU, no tax is due, yeah? If a Chinese company sells a car to someone in the EU, there's an import tax of 10%. If a Chinese car sells a car to someone in the UK or dealer in the UK, no tax is due. But what happens if a Chinese car is shipped to the UK and then on-shipped to the EU? What taxes do you pay? Well, the answer is the way customs works is you only pay tariffs when you get to your final destination. So even if we had a tariff here, if we had like a 2% tariff, you wouldn't pay any tariff because you're not importing it into the UK. You're importing it into the EU via the UK. And the customs documentation will say that. So when it gets to the UK, they'll slap a customs seal on it, which basically means it's not legally entering the UK's customs territory. It'll be shipped through the UK, back through the Channel Tunnel or whatever, or a ferry, into the EU, and at that point, you'll pay a 10% tax. So it doesn't matter it's gone from China to the EU via the UK, it's a Chinese car, there's a 10% tax. But you think, well, what happens if, say, a Chinese company do a deal with a UK company? Someone sets up a company in the UK, they buy an old defunct brand, Morris, say, and they do a deal with a Chinese company where the Chinese company will make the car, but in bits. They'll ship the bits to the UK, they'll put them together, slap a British badge on it, call it the Morris Patriot or something, and then they'll sell that to someone, dealer in Germany. It's a British car, right? 0%. No, it's not a British car, it's a Chinese car. Just because you've assembled the parts in the UK does not make it a British car. It's a Chinese car, so it's a 10% tariff. How does that work? Well, typically there's a threshold, which is usually 55%. It actually starts, I believe, under the terms of our trade deal, it starts lower and it will gradually taper into 55% to give us a bit of a chance. But basically, the car must be, or eventually it must be 55% British. 55% of the parts in that car need to be made in Britain for it to qualify as a British car. In this case, it doesn't, because they're all made in China, so it's a Chinese car. But here's the first sting in the tail. If you've got a car which genuinely is British, and let's say 60% of the parts are made in Britain, you've got to prove that it's British. You can't just ship it to the EU and say, hey, we're British, we don't have to pay a tax, right? You've got to have all the paperwork to prove that all your parts, you've got to trace the national origin, it's called country of origin. You've got to trace the national origin of all your parts to have the paperwork to prove that more than 60% of your car parts were made in the UK in order for it to qualify as a British car and have the 0% tariff. That's the extra paperwork. And there's a final twist in the tail. Imagine you're a Dutch, say, car manufacturer, I don't know, Spike or something, and you're shipping to somewhere that's got a good trade deal with the EU. But you get a lower tariff than the default. But you only qualify for that lower tariff if 55% of your car has parts made in the EU. Now imagine pre-Brexit, you were running at 60%. You're good. You're at 6% threshold, so your car, right, you've got to prove it, you've got to have all the paperwork, but your car qualifies for the lower tariff. But then 2016 comes along and we vote to leave. And then Theresa May comes on 2017 and does a conference speech where she announces she's going to go for a hard Brexit. Actually, it's 2016, I think she did that. That she announces that we will set our own custom tariffs, which means leaving the customs union. And you realise, you do some examination, you realise that your 60% EU parts actually breaks down to 40% EU 27 and 20% UK, because we've got a large automotive parts industry. That means, come Brexit, your percentage of parts in your car that are EU drops from 60% to 40%. And suddenly, all those trade deals the European Union has signed that gives you preferential tariffs, suddenly you don't qualify for any of them because your car is no longer sufficiently Dutch. This is why, in about 2017 or 2018, the Dutch government advised Dutch companies that use British subcontractors to start ditching their British subcontractors in favour of EU 27 subcontractors. They weren't being mean, they weren't being nasty, they weren't punishing us. It's because they realised that as soon as we left, we no longer qualified as EU parts. And it could bring those manufacturers below the 55% threshold. So there's two stings in the tail here. First of all, we still need the paperwork. And secondly, it makes it harder for us to sell parts to EU 27 companies. So that's the problem with leaving the customs union. Okay, so we've got all that, and you might say, well, yeah, Johnny, but you would say all that, you're pro-European, you're a Remainer. And yes, I am pro-European and I'm a Remainer. You might say, well, you're woke, you're a member of the Green Party, you're a vegan, you eat tofu, you support the RNLI. Yes, I'm proud to say I'm woke. But everything I've said has basically been logic. I haven't been sort of given my opinion as to how I'd like things to be. I've just been explaining the way the world works. And there's a fundamental point here. You cannot get the benefits of cooperation without the cooperation. Brexiteers often say we're being punished because the European Union won't cooperate with us, or they won't compromise. But the whole point of Brexit is to say we don't want to cooperate anymore. We don't want to compromise anymore. We want to do it our way, as we want to do it, which is fine. But then you don't get the benefits of cooperation. Now, people might also say, well, we have Brexit, so what's the point? This is a video you should have done 3 years ago. Well, yeah, fair enough. Fair point. You should have done. I mean, the point is just to explain this is where we are. People might say, well, we've now got to make Brexit a success. But you can't make something a success just because you want to. Clearly we can Brexit, we did. But making Brexit a success means a Brexit that actually makes sense, that leaves us better off than we were. And I don't see how that's possible. It's not about, well, if we all work together in refusing to work with Europeans, we can somehow make it work. That's not how it works. If you're saying what would I hope for, I guess I'd hope for some sort of soft Brexit deal. I'd ask the Europeans if we can join the single market and the customs union while accepting that they're not going to let us in as actual full members with votes and stuff. I mean, that's not great, but it's better than nothing. But I mean, really, I don't know. This video isn't about me saying what we can do, because I don't know. If I wanted to get to where we want to be, a prosperous, happy UK, I wouldn't have started from here. It's like you were driving a car far too fast. I told you to slow down. You didn't. You lost it on a bend. You crashed the car into a tree. You ripped it in half. Now you ask me what I would do. I don't know. You're the one who crashed the car. You tell me.